Americans may be unwittingly breaking the law while not having the slightest idea that their behavior may be illegal. To address this problem, I recently introduced the Mens Rea Reform Act of 2017, which sets a default mens rea requirement unless a statute explicitly states that an offense is intended to be a strict liability offense. General Sessions, would you agree that mens rea reform needs to be a part of our conversation on criminal justice reform?
Well, it should be a part of our conversation. It has to be, and you've made sure that it is over a number of years. You've raised it and discussed it, and I've heard you articulate your concerns. So, yes, I think it should be a part of what we do, and we'd be pleased to work with you to evaluate what kind of legislation might be appropriate.
Well, thank you, and I with you. Just 2 weeks ago, you issued a memorandum detailing 20 principles of religious liberty, as well as guidance for executive departments and agencies in implementing those principles. The very first principle is, I think, the most important. Quote, "The freedom of religion is a fundamental right of paramount importance," unquote. And it, quote, "is not a mere policy preference to be traded against other policy preferences. It is a fundamental right." Now, General Sessions, would you say this status of religious liberty as a fundamental and paramount right imposes the same obligation on the legislative branch as it does on the executive branch?
I think it does. I would just say this, Senator Hatch, your legislation that you worked so hard and passed, Religious Freedom Restoration Act, was a big part of the foundation of the principles we set out in that religious freedom guidance that we produce at the request of the president. We believe that there is a lack of appreciation of the rights of Americans not only to have private religious thoughts, but to exercise their religious freedom. That's what the Constitution says. You should have a right to, Congress shall make no law to establish a religion nor prohibit the free exercise thereof. You have raised that in the past, and it was a big part of what we did. The legislation you and Congress passed was a big part of what we were able to do.
Well, thank you. I'd like to just make a couple of comments. First, a comment on the Supreme Court's recent decision to grant cert in the Microsoft Ireland case. Now, I know the Department and I have different views on this case, and the topic remains controversial. That's why I introduced the International Communications Privacy Act, or ICPA, to create a clear framework for determining when law enforcement may access an individual's electronic communications, regardless of where those communications are stored. No matter which way the court rules, I believe this is a policy question that Congress needs to decide. Congress, not the court, should be the body that determines our data privacy laws. But I'm grateful to the Department for its work thus far with me on ICPA, and I hope you'll continue working with me and others on this committee to refine the bill so it can be enacted into law. I know my time has run, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that time.
Senator Leahy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Attorney General. And
thank you, Senator Leahy.
I look forward to you also coming to the Appropriations Committee to talk about your budget. When you appeared before the committee in January, after your testimony, I was concerned about it, and I asked you in writing whether you'd been in contact with anyone connected to the Russian government about the 2016 election. You answered emphatically no. We later learned about several meetings between you and Russian Ambassador Kislyak. We didn't hear this from you, we got it from the press. During the height of the 2016 campaign, you reportedly met with Kislyak at a Trump campaign event on foreign policy, at a Republican National Convention event, and in your Senate office, all while serving as chairman of the then candidate Trump's national security team. Now, I've never accused you of colluding with Russians, but you clearly, in your answer of no, you concealed your own contact with Russian officials at a time when such contacts were of great interest to the committee. So now one thing I do know, we've known each other for decades. We've worked together on many issues. If Senator Jeff Sessions was in my shoes and he asked the questions, he wouldn't tolerate being misled. So do you understand why members of this committee believe your answer no was false testimony?
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about that. I believe my answer was correct. I have the question you asked. You started off in the preamble, by the way, was that said the intelligence community has concluded that Russia intervened in the 2016 election in an effort to help elect Donald Trump. The report is available. Russian interference in our elections is larger than any candidate or political party. It's about protecting our democracy, and I agree with that. And then you ask a series of subparts, A, B, C, D.
The question I'm referring to is I asked you if you'd had any contact with the Russians, and you answered emphatically no.
Well, I just wanted to say that the entire context of all your questions dealt with interference in the campaign by the Russian officials.
Specifically, did you meet with any Russians?
And so the question you're referring to is subparagraph E, and it says several of President-elect's nominees or senior advisors have Russian ties. Have you been in contact with anyone connected to any part of the Russian government about the 2016 election, either before or after Election Day? And I took that to mean as not any casual conversation, but did I participate with Russians about the 2016 election, that something was wrong? Every one of your previous questions talk about improper involvement, and I felt the answer was no.
Okay,
and I
so
answered no,
well,
and I did not meet with them in any way about the election.
Then let me ask you about that, because later in March, when you did disclose such meetings, you said you did not recall what was said at the meetings. Now, your answer to my question was an emphatic no. It wasn't, I don't recall. Now, you're a lawyer. I'm a lawyer. You're, in fact, our nation's top lawyer. Is there a difference between responding no and I do not recall?
Well,
is that legally significant?
Yes, but
thank you.
Certainly it is, Mr. Senator Leahy.
So that if you could not recall, then you could not have answered my question, my first question, yes or no, if later you said you don't recall what was discussed. Now, the reason I asked that, U.S. intelligence intercepts reported in July appear to reveal that you did, in fact, discuss campaign issues with the Russian ambassador, including candidate Trump's position on Russian-related issues. So let me ask you this. Since the 2016 campaign, have you discussed with any Russian-connected official any of the following: emails, Russian interference, sanctions like the Magnitsky Act, the so-called adoption issue, or any policies or positions of the campaign or Trump presidency? This is since the 2016 campaign.
Senator Leahy, I want to be accurate, so I don't want to have any ambiguity about your questions, but that's a lot of questions. So let's think about this. I have never had a meeting with any Russian officials to discuss any kind of coordinating campaign efforts. I know you're shaking your head, so I want to first say.
Let's take it separate piece by piece.
All right.
Discuss any of the following: emails.
Repeat the question again about email.
Since the 2016 campaign, have you discussed with any Russian-connected official anything about emails?
Discuss with them. I don't recall having done any such thing.
Have you discussed with them Russian interference in our elections?
No.
Have you discussed anything like sanctions like the Magnitsky Act, what they call the adoption issue?
I don't believe I've ever had any discussion at any time about the Magnitsky Act.
Have you discussed with him any policies or positions of the campaign or Trump presidency?
I'm not sure about that. If I met with the Russian ambassador after I gave a speech at the Republican convention, he was right in front of the speakerphone, and we had we had an encounter there, and that he asked for an appointment in my office later. I met with 26 ambassadors in the last year, and he was one of them. He came into my office with two of my senior defense specialists and met with me for a while. And I don't recall any conversation about, what was this last subject? Let me get it right. You asked me.
I think he wants you to repeat something.
Yeah.
Any policies or positions of the campaign or Trump presidency?
I don't think there was any discussion about the details of the campaign, other than it could have been that in that meeting in my office or at the convention that some comment was made about what Trump's positions were. I think that's possible.
Were you requested, have you been interviewed, or have you been requested to be interviewed by the special counsel, either in connection with Director Comey's firing, the Russian investigation, or your own contact with Russian officials?
You'll have to ask the special counsel.
No, I'm asking you.
Repeat the question then.
Have you been interviewed or been requested to be interviewed by the special counsel, either in connection with Director Comey's firing, the Russian investigation, or your own contact with Russian officials?
Well, I'd be pleased to answer that. I'm not sure I should without clearing that with a special counsel. What do you think?
I'm just asking, have you been interviewed by them?
No.
You haven't been interviewed by the special counsel in any way, shape, or manner?
The answer is no.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Chairman, I've gone over my time. I appreciate the courtesy, but I do have a lot more questions along this line.
Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Attorney General Attorney General Sessions, for your service and for being here today. In May, you implemented a new charging policy for federal prosecutors. The policy requires, as I understand it, that prosecutors must be required to, quote, pursue the most serious, readily provable offense. The policy does permit prosecutors in some circumstances to apply for approval to charge something less than the most serious offense that is readily provable. Can you tell me, Attorney General Sessions, what factors the department will be considering in deciding whether or not to grant approval to those prosecutors in those instances who want to charge something less than the most serious, readily provable offense?
Senator Lee, the decision, that memo's decision, establishes the long-held position of the Department of Justice that a prosecutor should charge the most readily provable, serious, readily provable offense. It was altered by the previous Obama Department of Justice, I believe Attorney General Holder, in which he declared that you should not, and even directed you should not, charge what Congress has set as a serious offense that carries a minimum sentence.
So you were restoring what was previously known, I think, as the Ashcroft policy?
Previously set. And I was determined to have a simple directive to our capable assistant United States attorneys, not have a long 6-page memorandum. We submit a one-page, slightly over one-page memo to them, and it said, if you think that's not just, and you clear it with your U.S. attorney or the designee of the U.S. attorney, you can charge less than the most serious, readily approvable offense. Don't have to call Washington. Don't have to get some bureaucracy. We're going to trust you. And I told them I hope that would work. If we had serious problems with it, we would revisit it.
Okay. Do you?
And by the way, it only requires that the minimum sentence be imposed. Minimum mandatory doesn't require the maximum sentence, as some have said. It simply says that if you commit a serious crime that Congress says should carry a certain sentence, you shouldn't fail to charge that because you want to have a different sentencing result.
Do you track, or do you intend to keep track of how often how often prosecutors, and which prosecutors in particular, are departing from this?
Yes, we will. I don't know that we have a formal process. Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein is an experienced supervisor, 12 years of assistant United States attorneys. We've discussed this in depth, and we feel like that this is a sound policy for the Department of Justice and essentially restores us to what it used to be, but with perhaps even more flexibility than previous policies.
In March, Justice Thomas issued a statement in connection with the denial of certiorari by the Supreme Court in a case called Leonard versus Texas. In that statement, he suggested that modern civil asset forfeiture practices may be unconstitutional, at least cast some doubt on the constitutionality of those procedures as used by the federal government and many state governments. In May of this year, I wrote a letter to you asking whether the department would review its civil asset forfeiture policies and practices. In July, you announced some new policies that expanded the Department of Justice's use of civil asset forfeiture. Can you tell me whether you have asked the Office of Legal Counsel or any other component of the Department of Justice to provide a formal review of civil asset forfeiture practices of the federal government, of the states, and particularly the states and localities that participate in the equitable sharing program with the Department of Justice?
We had an intense series of discussions in the department about this subject. It's one that I'm familiar with, having served 12 years as United States Attorney myself and having utilized this policy. The policy was changed by the former Attorney General and constricted the ability of asset forfeiture in a number of ways. I simply restored the previous policy. The change only occurred 2 or 3 years ago. I believe it's the best policy, but I'm aware of the serious concerns you have and others have. I have constricted and placed some limits on how we do these forfeitures, and I have just announced the appointment of a special director of accountability to be in charge of all the forfeitures in the United States, to review them, to review any complaints that arise. We want to carry out this policy effectively and fairly without abusing anybody's rights. I would note that for decades it's been affirmed by the Supreme Court. I don't believe there are votes on the Supreme Court that would declare it somehow now not legal, and we want to do it right.
I'm not sure that's clear one way or another. I mean, I understand your position, but I think there is some lack of clarity on this, and I think the statement issued by Justice Thomas in connection with the denial of certiorari in Leonard versus Texas does cast some doubt on it. But one of my questions is, hey, have you asked the Office of Legal Counsel for an opinion on this?
We're simply restoring the law that's been in effect for decades, and I don't know that we've asked a formal opinion of the Office of Legal Counsel, and don't think it's necessary to do so.
Okay. As you know, the reason I'm concerned about this is because in our criminal justice
I'm John
system
Scott in New
the
York,
United States.
along
We
with
have robust
Melissa
protections
Francis.
for the accused.
We are continuing to monitor the Senate Judiciary Committee and the
entitled
testimony
to
of the Attorney
a jury
General, the
trial
nation's top law
appointed
enforcement
counsel.
officer.
You have a lot of due
In
process
front of
protections.
that committee, Jeff Sessions has covered a wide range of topics, and for some perspective, let's bring in Fox News contributor Bill McGurn. He is the Main Street columnist for the Wall Street Journal, also the former chief speechwriter for President George W. Bush. It staggers the mind sometimes to think of how many issues that bedevil this country land right in the lap of the Attorney General and the Department of Justice. We've talked about, the firing of the FBI director, murder rates in this country that are on the rise, the opioid epidemic, Russian meddling in the election, Russian ownership of U.S. uranium supplies. What strikes you as the most significant thing you've heard in this morning's testimony thus far?
Hey, John, I'm not sure I found something that's striking. It seems to me that a lot of this is a rehash of old ground, asking Jeff Sessions, whether he met with Russians, what they discussed, and so forth. Look, I think there's a lot out there that's changed since November. For example, the FBI reports that Russia was actively involved in trying to bribe people over here to its benefit. Second, what I'm really waiting to see is for Mr. Grassley to ask Mr. Sessions why the FBI is not cooperating with Congress on these investigations and turning over, for example, transcripts the FBI had from the Office of Special Counsel investigation into James Comey and the Hillary Clinton matter, and as well as the Steele dossier. The FBI has been a big stonewalling block in this, and the FBI works for the Department of Justice. It'd be nice to hear some questions on those issues.
Same with, along those lines, the tarmac meeting between the former Attorney General Loretta Lynch and former President Clinton.
Yeah, look, I think that the oversight hearings, the Judiciary Committee, this is exactly the mechanism that our Constitution provides. That it's the elected representatives of the American people that are there to enforce accountability from our government, from our executive branch. And instead, we have special prosecutors and so forth. And again, if you look at Judicial Watch and the lawsuits that it's had, it's been far more successful in unearthing information from the executive branches than I think Congress has. And that's a big problem. I think Congress needs to assert its authority, and it needs to get the Attorney General on record why the FBI and DOJ are not cooperating with the committees in Congress investigating these things. And if they don't cooperate, Congress has means to make them do that, including contempt citations.
Well, we heard a pretty strong denial from the Attorney General today of the question that the Democrats have tried to seize upon really ever since he was appointed. It was during his questioning his nomination process to become Attorney General when he was asked about meetings with Russians and did he meet with anybody. That kind of tripped him up and ended up in his recusal from anything involving the Russia investigation of the Justice Department. But today he gave a pretty strong denial of the fact that he had anything to do with any Russian meetings.
Look, I agree, John.
Democrats seem to be concerned about.
The Attorney General can speak for himself. He's an able lawyer. He knows what's going on. I read him as saying, I did meet with these people. I inadvertently didn't disclose it, but we did not discuss in any way the election. That's how I read his answer. And again, we're not much further than we were when this first came up. It seems to me there's been so much more that's come out, and so far the committee hasn't got to it. And really, I think the Attorney General needs to go on record on why the FBI is not cooperating.
Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont, one of the top members of this committee, asked him about whether he had been interviewed by the special counsel investigating the Russia matter. He said no. Is that significant to you?
I don't know. Look, I wish I lived in a world where special prosecutors weren't significant, because it seems to me this is a perfect example of getting it backward. In our system, the Constitution gives Congress the power to hold the executive branch accountable. It doesn't mention special prosecutors. And the problem with the special prosecutor is it corrupts the constitutional process, and it allows people to hide behind a special prosecutor and say, well, I can't answer this question because the special prosecutor is looking into it, or I can't ask this question because the special prosecutor is looking into it. Look, I want the information to go to the elected representatives of the American people and let them be accountable for it.
Yeah. Bill, it's Melissa Francis here. I had a couple questions for you. I thought one thing that was interesting was they wanted to drill down on the reasons that he believed Jim Comey was fired, saying, you know, did you recommend to the president or not? He said one thing, and then he did another interview saying he was going to fire him anyway. And Jeff Sessions was very clear. You know, he said, when I watched that press conference where he went out and Comey said, you know, we recommended to DOJ, we told them there was no case here, you know, and not to pursue. Jeff Sessions was very clear that that's a usurpation of the DOJ's authority, and that he had clearly overstepped his role. And then when he came back and testified again, he said, I would have done the same thing again. And Jeff Sessions said, I respect him. He's done a lot of good work. But, you know, that was a clear usurpation, and the department, quote, needed a fresh start. What did you think of that exchange? Yeah, look, I think James Comey's a whole other issue. I think the president had excellent reasons to fire him. His big mistake was waiting as long as he did. You know, Mr. Comey was sort of distrusted by both Democrats and Republicans, by Democrats who thought he cost Hillary the election, by Republicans who thought he wasn't really doing an investigation. We've learned so much since that news happened, since the director was fired. For example, we've learned that the director was exchanging emails with his staff about a draft statement exonerating Mrs. Clinton before the FBI had even interviewed her. Yeah. Okay, we learned about the Steele dossier, that the FBI had some kind of relationship with Christopher Steele, who put together this now discredited dossier. What we want to know is whether any of that information was used to get a FISA warrant, and was it used when the FBI director had doubts about its veracity. I think that the developments that we've seen, say the questions you have, are becoming far more relevant. I think at some point when Congress gets these answers, it needs to put the director back on the Hill under oath to answer them, and to answer why he sort of misled Congress. For example, when he said he didn't make his decision about Mrs. Clinton until after they'd interviewed. Absolutely. Stand by. We will come back to you in a bit, but we want to listen back into this testimony.
Get to one part of your statement here that I take personally, because I happen to represent the city of Chicago, and I'm honored to represent that city. I know you are. What happened in Las Vegas was tragic and awful and heartbreaking. 59 people killed, over 500 wounded by gunshots in just a brief period of time with some military-type weapon. It was just awful, horrific, and disgusting. Having said that, so far this year, 3,000 people have been injured by gunshot in the city of Chicago, and over 500 have been killed. This is not something that is a political debate in my heart. It breaks my heart to think what the families are going through in this city that I represent. The superintendent of police who's worked there, and you gave credit to local law enforcement, I'm glad you did. I join you in that. He's worked in that police department for 30 years. I want to read to you what he said. The federal government's plans, the terminating of burned grant funds, will hamper community policing and undermine the work our men and women have done to reduce shootings by 16% so far this year. And this is the sentence I want to focus on. If I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Undocumented immigrants are not driving violence in Chicago. And that's why I want our officers focused on community policing and not trying to be immigration police. The money we are going to get, we hope to get, from the federal government for burn grants, we're putting into a program called ShotSpotter. You probably know what that is. But it's a monitoring device in our city, block by block, that can tell instantaneously when a gun has been shot. And so our police can respond instantaneously to try to get the shooters and to save the life of the victim. You want to cut back these funds because you want the city of Chicago to play the role of immigration police on federal civil laws. Mr. Attorney General, you're not helping us solve the murder problem in the city of Chicago by taking away these federal funds. And the superintendent says that your pursuit of undocumented immigrants has little or nothing to do with gun violence in Chicago.
Well, Chicago is a great city. It's got many good things going for it. I do think this murder rate is a cloud over the city, and it looks like this year may be even higher murder rate than last year. Good community-based policing is absolutely essential for this. I'm worried about the health and morale of the Chicago Police Department. We'd like to see that improved. I think the politicians cannot say that if you remove a violent criminal from America that's illegally in the country and he's arrested by the Chicago police and put in the Chicago jail, that once they're released, they shouldn't be turned over to the federal ICE officers so they can be removed from the country. They were here illegally to begin with, much less commit another crime, and then should not be. How does that make the city of Chicago safer when you don't remove criminals who are illegally in the country?
You can't give an opening statement throwing a bouquet to local police and then ignore what the superintendent of police in Chicago tells you has nothing to do with gun violence. You want to cut off federal funds to that city and come here and criticize the murder rate.
I have increased the number of ATF agents to prosecute gun crimes in Chicago by 12, which is quite a large number, more than any other city, I believe. Yes. And, well, we're not, the United States government can't take over law enforcement for the city of Chicago. We're not doing it for New York. We're not doing it for a lot of other places.
Nor can the city of Chicago
we have made a surge of ATF agents to Chicago, and we'll continue to work with you. I do not want to not have grants go to Chicago, but we need their support. When somebody's arrested in the jail that's due to be deported, we just simply ask that they call us so we can come by and pick them up if they need to be removed. That's not happening, and we've got to work through it some way.
Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General session. Thank you. Welcome back. Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Did you conspire with Russia or an agent of the Russian government to influence the outcome of the 2016 presidential election?
No.
Do you want the special counsel who is investigating those matters to succeed?
I want him to complete his investigation professionally, yes.
If he asked you for your cooperation, would you give it?
Yes.
If he asked to meet with you to discuss what, if anything, you know about all that, would you agree to meet with him?
Absolutely.
I want to talk to you for a second about New Orleans. New Orleans is extraordinarily important to my state. My first job in government was with a governor, Governor Buddy Romer, and at the time he took an economic development trip to Japan. He tells a story he was meeting with about 20 Japanese business people. And he started off by asking them, he said, how many of you have been to Louisiana? He said, five Japanese business people raised their hand. Then he said, how many of you have been to New Orleans? He said, 15 raised their hand. It's a big part of our culture and our economy. We've got a crime problem in New Orleans, as you know. We had a police officer, Officer McNeil, killed in the line of duty this weekend. The burn grants are very important to New Orleans to help us fight crime. Now, your office wrote a letter to my friend Mayor Landrieu asking him questions about his or the city's compliance with 8 U.S.C. Section 1373. Let me cut to the chase. There have been allegations that New Orleans is a sanctuary city. You have asked for information. Mayor Landrieu, who again is my friend, but you've got to call him like you see him, wrote you back a very unprofessional letter. And I'm sorry for that. He called you caustic. He suggested you were just a mere politician. He said you were scapegoating immigrants. He called you a fear mongerer. And he basically called you a liar. And I don't consider that to be productive discourse. So I apologize on behalf of Louisiana.
So the Senate Judiciary Committee continues to question the Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions. They are getting into some of the questions involving sanctuary cities and how the Department of Justice is handling them. Fox News contributor Bill McGurn is still with us, Main Street columnist for the Wall Street Journal and also a former speechwriter for President George W. Bush. When Dick Durbin, the senator from Illinois, was taking on the Attorney General over sanctuary city policy and the Department of Justice's approach trying to essentially withhold federal funds from sanctuary cities. What did you think of that exchange, Bill?
Well, I think it's a fair question. Look, when I look at Dick Durbin, I remember the same man who just about a month ago was asking Amy Coney Barrett essentially, are you now or have you ever been an Orthodox Catholic? So I take his kind of interrogations with a grain of salt. Look, I think there's three things that they're talking about. One, the murder rate in Chicago, which is very high and unconscionable. Whether this has anything to do with illegal immigrants, I don't know. But second, the administration, I think, is perfectly within its rights to deny funds to cities that are not cooperating with the federal government about illegal immigration. Chicago's free to keep that policy. They're just not free to get the money from the administration as they do that. So, you know, it's a legitimate question, but I'm not sure that Senator Durbin's on the stronger side of that argument.
Yeah, it seems like, you know, most of the time, federal law trumps all when you're at the state and local level, except when some of these local government decides federal law doesn't trump all.
Well, except for progressives, they want their cake and their taxpayer dollars too to pay for it. So,
all right, Bill McGurn, we are going to continue to keep an eye on this hearing.
All right, Catherine Herridge is standing by live to break it all down. So to people out in the audience, while these hearings are going on, we're all scribbling and taking notes. Catherine Herridge, in my opinion, is the best one at that, at picking out what she's heard that makes a difference, that's news. Catherine, what have you heard?
Well, there's sort of two exchanges, Melissa, that really jump out at me. The first came from the ranking Democrat on the committee, Dianne Feinstein, asking the Attorney General Jeff Sessions to confirm that he was called upon by the president, along with the Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, to write a recommendation about Jim Comey, the FBI director, and his status, whether he should be fired. That was on May 9th. And then Senator Feinstein said to Attorney General Sessions, did the president ever talk about lifting the Russian cloud that was hanging over him? And the Attorney General said that he could not answer. He wanted to respect the confidential nature, of his discussions with the president. So this is the issue of executive privilege. The other conversation that jumped out of me came from another Democrat, Senator Leahy, who talked about the issue of Russian collusion. He said to the Attorney General Jeff Sessions, and this was no small thing because these men have known each other for decades, that Sessions needed to understand that from Leahy's point of view, they felt that he had misled the Senate committee about his contacts with the Russians in 2016. And the Attorney General said that he didn't believe that casual conversations or contacts with the Russian ambassador, Sergei Kislyak, really amounted to any type of coordination or collusion, and that he felt that respectfully he had given an honest answer. The third thing I just want to draw your attention to is actually happening over on the House side of Capitol Hill. We've had confirmation in the last few minutes that two witnesses, they're associated with this firm Fusion GPS. This is an opposition research firm that commissioned this unverified anti-Trump dossier. That matters because the dossier is one of the things that kick-started the whole Russia investigation at the FBI. These two witnesses, Peter Fritsch and Thomas Catan, have met in a closed session with the House Intelligence Committee, and they have taken the fifth to every question that was asked to them about the dossier, the sources for the dossier, payment, and other issues associated with it. One of the principals of Fusion GPS, Glenn Simpson, did not appear today, but he has been subpoenaed to appear in the future. So the bottom line is that the Attorney General is not willing to discuss his private conversations with the President about the firing of FBI Director James Comey. He's pushing back on the accusation from Democrats that he misled them about his contacts with the Russians, and two key figures who were part of the group that commissioned the dossier. The dossier is one of the foundational